The candles in Carlton House's second gallery had been lit for 3 hours before anyone noticed she had come back. That was by design. Georgiana Ashworth, Duchess of Ravensworth in her own right, had learned during the 2 years of her absence that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in this city was arrive loudly. She had arrived at 9:15 on the arm of no one, in a gown the color of deep water before a storm, and she had taken her place near the third window before the first whisper reached the other end of the room. By the time the whisper completed its circuit and returned to her, she had already accepted a glass of rathered wine she did not intend to drink, and exchanged 3 sentences about the weather with Lord Fenton's wife, who was too short-sighted to have recognized her, and too kind to have cared if she had. The whisper said, she was alive. The room would catch up. Rooms always did. She had left London in the spring of 1821, under conditions she had not chosen, and in circumstances she had not made. The version of events the season had assembled in her absence was considerably more colorful than the truth, which was simply that her husband had died of a fever in March. His younger brother, Crispin Ashworth, had contested the terms of the ducal charter that granted her the title in her own right, and the Court of Chancery had taken 14 months to affirm what every solicitor in the city had privately agreed was an open question. She had spent those 14 months at Ravensworth Hall in Northumberland, managing the estate, keeping the accounts, and reading, with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the words of a judgment would shape the remainder of her life. The Court of Chancery had ruled in January. She had given herself 3 months of winter quiet. Then she had written to her dressmaker. Now she was here, and the gown was doing exactly what she had asked it to do, which was to make the question of her worthiness somebody else's problem to answer. She was 31 years old and had learned to occupy a room as if the room had been built around her. It had not always been so. If you had come to know her at 23, when she had arrived in London for her first season with her father's declining health, and her mother's old pearls, and nothing else to recommend her, you would not have recognized her now. You might have noticed a quiet girl with careful posture, and eyes that registered more than her expression confirmed, who spoke when spoken to and watched when no one spoke to her. You would not have known that behind that stillness was a mind that had been running the household accounts of Hartmoor Park since the age of 17, and that the girl's father, Sir Edmund Hartmoor, had taught her everything he knew about land tenure, and nothing at all about how to make herself agreeable to men who considered those subjects unseemly in a woman. She had made one enduring friend that first season, Marjorie Vane, Countess of Ashfield, who had spotted her at Lady Dundas's music hall, cornered her near the pianoforte, and said, without preamble, that she had been watching her for 20 minutes and found her the most sensible person in the room. Marjorie was 52 years old, widowed, and famously unconcerned with anyone's opinion except her own. She had introduced Georgiana to the Duke of Ravensworth 6 weeks later, at a supper party in Grosvenor Square, and what had followed between Georgiana and the Duke was quiet and specific, and had surprised everyone, including herself. He had been 41. She had been 24. The match had confused the season, which had expected him to marry a woman of greater rank and expected her to be grateful for any offer at all. He had proposed in May. They had married in June. He had been kind and principled and had loved her in the way of a man who had not expected to love anyone again, which is to say carefully and with a consistent private gratitude. She had loved him in return, which is to say practically and with the full weight of her attention. He had died at 48. She had been 30. What had followed was the year of Crispin. Crispin Ashworth was 3 years younger than his brother and had inherited all of the family's confidence and none of its restraint. He had moved through society's drawing rooms with the ease of a man who understood that his name was his argument, and for 20 years that understanding had served him adequately. When his brother died and left the title, by the terms of a modified charter dating to the reign of George II, to the wife rather than the male heir, Crispin had done the only thing available to a man of his temperament, which was to deny it loudly in every drawing room in London until the volume of his denial had produced, in the season's attentive ear, the credible impression that the widowed Duchess had obtained her title through some unnamed and unspecified impropriety. He had never said anything specific. He had not needed to. The season did not require specifics. It required only the invitation to speculate. To the ton, she became the woman in the contested house, the woman Crispin called unsuitable, the woman the courts would surely overturn. She had heard the word that circulated, eventually, through Marjorie's faithful correspondence. The word was grasping. Used with a delicate air of sympathy that made it worse. She had read every letter from Marjorie with care, set each aside in a cedar box beside the window, and continued managing the estate. Chancery had ruled. She was the Duchess of Ravesworth. She had 3 houses, 11,000 acres in Northumberland, and a gown the color of deep water, and she had come back. If you are still here, on the edge of this room, watching what happens next, then you already understand that the most important thing about a woman's return is not the return itself, but the quality of attention it receives. Stay close. The room has not yet decided what it will do with her. The man who noticed her first, after Lord Fenton's wife, was not someone she had expected. The Earl of Blackmore stood at the far end of the second gallery in conversation with his steward and a man she did not recognize, and she knew he had seen her because he stopped speaking for the space of 2 seconds and then resumed at precisely the same register, which was a better performance than most men could have managed. She knew the Earl of Blackmore the way one knows a figure in a room one has passed through on several previous occasions. By reputation and by outline, rather than by acquaintance. He was 35, recently returned from an 18-month residence in Edinburgh, where he had apparently been settling a matter connected to his late father's estate, and the season regarded him as a man of formidable intelligence and very little warmth, which was the season's polite way of saying that he had buried a wife 5 years ago and had not forgiven anyone for expecting him to recover. His name was Edmund Caverley, and she noted, with the calm precision of a woman who noticed everything and appeared to notice nothing, that he had not looked away from his steward's document, even as his eyes moved. She returned her attention to the room. She did not need Edmund Caverley's attention. She needed the room's. It came in stages. First the whispers, which she had expected, then the careful approaches, which she had prepared for. Lady Aston arrived first, feigning surprise so badly that Georgiana felt almost sorry for her, and inquired after her health with an expression that suggested the inquiry was really about the title, the lawsuit, and the status of her claims. Georgiana answered about her health only, with a warmth she did not feel, and a specificity that gave Lady Aston nothing to carry forward. She withdrew. Then came Lord Dunmore, who had been a friend of her husband's and who had the grace to appear genuinely glad to see her. Then Mrs. Holt, who was Crispin's particular ally in the upper drawing rooms, and who arrived with a smile that was doing work her face had not agreed to. "My dear," said Mrs. Holt. She said it the way one addresses a woman one has just now reconsidered. "We had begun to wonder whether you meant to return at all." "Had you?" said Georgiana. "Not a question. Crispin suggested you might find London altered. After everything, London is precisely as I left it," Georgiana said. "The light is the same. The wine is the same." She looked past Mrs. Holt's shoulder for precisely 1 second. "The conversation is the same." Mrs. Holt's smile performed a complicated maneuver that left her dignity technically intact. Georgiana turned to speak with Lord Dunmore. It was during this exchange that she became aware, without turning her head, that the Earl of Blackmore had crossed half the distance between them. Not toward her, toward the refreshment table, which was a perfectly defensible route, and yet her awareness of his position was the specific alertness of a woman whose body has elected to track someone her mind has not yet agreed to. She felt it in the fine hairs along her left arm and in a sudden clarity about exactly where her hands were. She filed this information away and continued speaking. When she finally turned, she found him beside the refreshment table with a glass of wine he did not appear to be drinking, watching the room with the careful attention of a man cataloguing rather than enjoying it. He was taller than she had understood from across the gallery. With the composed stillness of a man who had learned, at some cost, to occupy space without filling it with sound, his jaw was set at the particular angle of a man who is thinking about something other than where he is standing. He looked at her. She looked at him. He inclined his head with the minimal precision of a man who has decided something without consulting the decision aloud. She did the same. That was the whole of their first conversation, and it communicated, with the economy that the season's formal vocabulary occasionally permitted, that they had each registered the other as someone worth the trouble of accuracy. She was not entirely sure what to do with that. She was sure, however, that she would not be the one to pursue it. The evening continued. She was careful and deliberate, and left at exactly the right moment, neither early enough to suggest retreat, nor late enough to permit the impression of effort. She said good-night to Marjorie, who had appeared at 10 and had spent the intervening hour surveying the room with the expression of a general reviewing a satisfactory disposition of troops. "Well," said Marjorie, "you have survived the first encounter admirably. Crispin will hear of your return by morning." "He will hear of it by midnight," Georgiana said. "Mrs. Holt will tell him the moment she reaches her carriage." "Are you frightened?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew to consider questions. "No," she said. "Prepared." Marjorie studied her for a moment. "Blackmore watched you for the better part of an hour." "He watched the room," Georgiana said. "He watched you," Marjorie said, with the firmness of a woman who had been watching rooms for 50 years. "There is a difference." She did not answer. The second encounter was not at Carlton House. It was on a wet morning in Green Park, where Georgiana had gone to walk because the house felt too still, and she required the particular medicine of cold air. She walked alone, which the season would have found improper, with her maid following at 20 paces, which made it technically acceptable. She had been walking for half an hour when she became aware of a horse keeping pace along the path above her, and she looked up to find the Earl of Blackmore on a gray horse, moving at the particular speed of a man who is not in a hurry, but is not in a hurry either. He dismounted when he saw her look up. "Your Grace," he said. He said it without ceremony, without the careful inflation that many men put into the title when addressing her, as though her right to it were somehow enhanced by their willingness to use it. He said it the way one says a fact. "Lord Blackmore," she said. He fell into step beside her, which was either a liberty or a naturalness, and she could not immediately determine which. His horse followed, which she supposed settled the question of intention. A man who brings his horse into a walk is not planning to leave quickly. "You managed the evening well," he said. She glanced at him. "Mrs. Holt's report was that thorough?" Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but belonged to the same family. "I do not require Mrs. Holt. I was present." "I know," she said. A pause. The wet grass was silvered, and the trees stood in the gray light with the patient dignity of things that have endured many seasons. "Crispin is in town," he said. I expected him to be. He arrived last night. He has already called on Lord Harcastle and on Viscount Pembry. She understood this. Harcastle and Pembry sat on a committee that oversaw certain hereditary petitions. Crispin was not done. He had lost in Chancery. But a man who had organized 2 years of whispers was a man who understood that legal verdicts and social verdicts were not the same instrument. I thank you for the intelligence, she said, with the careful formality of a woman who does not wish to appear either grateful or suspicious, and who is both. He stopped walking. She stopped because it would have been stranger to continue. I did not tell you to be thanked, he said. The words were level. Not unkind. I told you because I was at Ravesworth twice in the summer of 1818, when your husband invited me to consult on a drainage question in the North Field. And I watched you manage a household of 40 persons with a competence that would have done credit to any steward in England. He paused. And because the thing that was done to you by rumor was a specific cruelty, and I find specific cruelties offensive. She looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky behind him, and held the expression of a man who has said a difficult thing and will not unsay it. You remember the visit, she said. I remember everything I have occasion to observe carefully, he said. She would think about this later, she told herself. Not now, in the wet park, with the words still hanging between them. Then I will tell you what you may not know, she said. I intend to attend the Pemberton Ball on Thursday. I intend to attend the Harcastle Musicale on the following Monday. I intend to be present, in silk, at every occasion that will have me, until the season recalls that I was always here, and the rumor had no body to bury. His jaw moved slightly, not agreement exactly, but the physical acknowledgement that he had heard something worth registering. I will be at the Pemberton Ball, he said. She inclined her head. Then we shall see each other there. He mounted his horse with the economical grace of a man who has ridden since childhood, and he did not look back as the gray horse turned toward the path. She stood in the wet grass and breathed the cold air and informed her racing pulse that it was entirely uncalled for. It did not listen. There is a kind of knowing the body arrives at before the mind has been consulted, and Georgiana Hartmore Ashworth, who had spent her adult life trusting her mind's superior information, was not accustomed to arriving at it first through her hands or her sternum. Standing in Green Park with the cold air on her face and the sound of his horse receding behind her, she was aware of something that wanted a name she was not yet prepared to give it. She walked home quickly and sat down with the estate accounts, which were accurate and predictable, and required nothing of her but attention. The Pemberton Ball was crowded enough that the whispers could not travel cleanly, which was an advantage she had not anticipated but was grateful for. She arrived at 9, again with calculation, and again went first to Marjorie's side, because Marjorie's side was the safest terrain in the room, and because Marjorie asked nothing of her except honesty, which was the easiest thing to give. Thing 2. Crispin arrived at 9:30. She had been watching the door with the peripheral attention of a woman who knows how to watch doors without appearing to, and she was aware of the precise moment the room registered his arrival, which was also the moment it registered hers, and then the moment it registered that both of them were in the same room simultaneously, and began arranging itself around that fact. He was 44 years old, and still handsome in the way of a man who had always understood himself to be so. He wore his confidence the way he wore his coat, as though removing either were not a procedure he had considered. He scanned the room with the thoroughness of a man looking for a specific object, and when his gaze found her, he did not look away. She did not look away either. That lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to speak to Lord Harcastle, who was standing 2 feet to his right, and the room exhaled. Marjorie's hand closed briefly around her wrist. "Steady," she said very quietly. "I am entirely steady," Georgiana said. She was not entirely steady, but she was steady enough, which is the actual requirement. It was 40 minutes later, during a break between the second and third sets, that Crispin approached her directly. He came through a gap in the crowd with the air of a man executing a plan he had formed in advance, and she had half a second to arrange her face before he arrived. "Georgiana," he said, which was not the correct form of address, and they both knew it. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, with a precision that landed like a closed door. A flicker crossed his face. "We need not be formal." "I prefer it," she said pleasantly. "In public settings?" "I had heard you were returned." He said it as though this were a moderate surprise, which they both knew it was not. "I hope you found the North quiet and restorative." "I found it," she said. "Very productive." His smile did not shift, but something behind it did. "The Chancery ruling has settled the matter legally, of course." He let the word legally sit in the air between them for a deliberate moment. "Though one cannot always legislate social understanding." "No," she agreed in the same pleasant voice. "One cannot, as you discovered." A pause that was shorter than it felt. "There are those," he said carefully, "who remain uncertain of the circumstances of your husband's final instructions. He was not well in those last weeks." "His judgment." "His judgment," she said, "was as clear in his final weeks as it was in the preceding 23 years of his life. The Court of Chancery examined his correspondence, his legal records, and the testimony of 3 witnesses. They found no evidence of impaired judgment. I believe their conclusion was published in the Gazette." "The law," he said, "and the sentiment of those who knew him are not always aligned." "The sentiment of those who knew him," she said, "is that he was a man of superior intelligence, who married whom he wished and disposed of his estate as he intended." She looked at him without hostility and without warmth. "I am sorry, Crispin. I know this was not the outcome you expected. I am genuinely sorry. I will not pretend that it is provisional." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of them. Then he said, with a flatness that was almost respect, "You have become very certain." "I have always been certain," she said. "I was simply not certain I was permitted to say so." He withdrew. She breathed. The room around her was doing something she could feel but not see, a quality of collective attention resolving, the way a flock of birds settles back into stillness after a single sudden movement. She reached for a glass of water and found that her hand was steady. He had come. She had held. She looked up and found him 15 feet away, and his face, when she met his eyes, held something she could not name precisely, but it occupied the territory between recognition and relief. He did not cross the room. He did not need to. The look itself had been a kind of crossing. She discovered in the days that followed that she was thinking about him more than the situation warranted. This was inconvenient. She had returned to London with a clear program. She would re-establish her presence, manage the estate accounts from the townhouse, attend the necessary occasions, and allow the season to remember that she was simply a woman with a title and a purpose, neither scandalous nor pitiable. There was no room in that program for the Earl of Blackmore's gray eyes, or the particular economy of his sentences, or the way he had said, "I find specific cruelties offensive," as though he were reporting an observable natural law. He called on her on a Wednesday morning, which was correct in form and slightly surprising in timing, as she had not sent him any signal that she was receiving. She would later understand that this was because he did not wait for signals he was capable of reading the situation directly. She received him in the front sitting room, with Marjorie present as chaperone, which Marjorie treated with the graceful detachment of a woman who has performed that function many times and considers it excellent theater. He sat across from her with his hat in his hands and spoke about the Hardcastle Musicale, which was in 4 days, and about the committee Crispin was working to influence, and about what he had learned from his solicitor regarding the specific nature of Crispin's remaining avenues of recourse, which were narrow and growing narrower. He had done this research with the methodical interest of a man who had decided something and was implementing it. She watched him as he spoke and noted the slight tension at his temples and the way he held perfectly still when discussing the details most men would have gestured through. She noted that he did not soften his sentences for her benefit, did not round the difficult facts, did not assume she could not receive them directly. She valued this so much, it was almost embarrassing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked when he paused. He looked at her. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it." She folded her hands in her lap, which was the gesture she made when she was trying to be precise. "You have no particular obligation here. We had not spoken more than twice before last week. You have your own affairs." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 5 years ago," he said. She waited. "She was ill for 2 years before that. She bore it with a composure I did not understand at the time, and I have spent 5 years coming to understand it, and what I understand is that she was very quiet and very steady, and I failed to see the full weight of what she was carrying until she was no longer present to carry it." He paused. He was looking at his hat, which had a slight crease in the brim. "I have since developed a significant intolerance for the failure to see." She did not say anything for a moment. "That is," she said, "a very costly way to learn a thing." "Yes," he said simply. It was. She understood in the silence that followed that he had not told many people this, and that telling her was a deliberate act rather than a spillage, and that the specific shape of what he was offering required her to receive it carefully, or it would mean nothing. "My husband taught me the estate," she said. "Before we were married, he wrote to my father and asked whether it would be possible for me to review the ledgers during a visit. It was an unusual request. My father permitted it because he trusted the Duke implicitly. I reviewed the ledgers. I had questions. He answered them. We spent 3 afternoons in the library with the account books. And I think we both understood, somewhere in the 3rd afternoon, that something was happening that neither of us had planned." She looked at her own hands. "He told me afterward that he had been looking for years for someone who would take the work seriously. He had not expected to find her in a 24-year-old girl from Northumberland who asked better questions than his steward. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she had come to understand was not passive. It was the attention of a man who is cataloging and keeping. "What did you feel?" he said. "In the 3rd afternoon?" She considered this honestly, because the question deserved honesty. "I felt, for the first time in my life, that I was the right size for the room I was in." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "Come to the Hardcastle Musicale Monday." I was already planning to attend. "I know. I meant." He paused, and she had the impression of a man carefully choosing the container for something that did not fit neatly into the available forms. "I meant that I will be there, and I would like to be present in a way that the room can see." She held his gaze. The fire in the grate made a small sound. Marjorie, to her credit, gave no indication of being present. "That is," she said, "a specific offer." "Yes," he said. "It is." She understood what it would mean. She understood that the season would see it and would draw a conclusion that was not wrong exactly, but was considerably ahead of where she and the Earl actually stood. She understood that Crispin would see it and that it would constitute a new variable in his calculations. She understood that she was 31 years old and had not expected, when she dressed that morning, to be making a decision of this kind. "I will see you at the Harcastle Musicale," she said. He inclined his head. He stood. He said good morning to Marjorie with the same minimal precision he used for everything, and he left. Marjorie waited until she heard the front door. "Well," she said. "Do not," said Georgiana. "I merely," Marjorie said, "wish to observe that he did not come here to discuss the committee. I'm aware. And that he told you about his wife. Marjorie." "I am 62 years old," Marjorie said, with the serenity of someone who has earned certain conversational liberties. "And I have seen a great many men make a great many overtures, and what that man just did is the equivalent, for a man of his temperament, of a full declaration in a ballroom." Georgiana looked at her for a long moment. "It is an intention," she said, "not a declaration." "From a man who weighs every word before he produces it," Marjorie said. "They are the same thing." The Harcastle Musicale was in a long room on the first floor with tall windows and cream walls and candles in branched holders along every surface. The musicians were in the far corner, and the guests arranged themselves along the room's length in a loose hierarchy that had sorted itself, as these things always did, within 10 minutes of the doors opening. She arrived at 7:15. He was already there. He was in conversation with Sir William Harcastle, which meant he had arrived early enough to speak with the host, which was a statement about his evening's priorities without being a statement in words. She saw him register her arrival from a distance of 30 feet, and she saw, more important, the room register that he had registered it. The evening proceeded. There was music. There was conversation. Crispin arrived at 8:30 and took up a position at the far end of the room with Mrs. Holt and the baronet, and the particular arrangement of his posture communicated that he had come with a purpose that the music was merely the occasion for. She was speaking with Dunmore about the Northumberland drainage project, which was a real project and interested her genuinely when she became aware that Crispin had moved. He was working his way along the room's edge with the careful speed of a man who has a destination in mind and does not wish to appear to have one. He stopped beside Lady Harcastle, who was standing near the window with 2 women Georgiana did not know well. She could not hear the exchange from where she stood, but she could see Lady Harcastle's expression change, and she understood that whatever Crispin was saying had found its mark. She turned back to him and asked a question about clay drainage that required a detailed answer. And while receiving the detailed answer, she assessed the room with the careful peripheral attention that had become, over 2 years of managed solitude, her most reliable instrument. What she saw was that the hostess had now said something to one of the 2 unknown women, and that woman had looked toward Georgiana with the specific quality of attention that accompanies newly acquired information. Crispin had moved on. He was very good at this, she acknowledged. He planted seeds without appearing to plant anything, and the garden arranged itself without his visible hand. The word, she suspected, was still grasping. Or perhaps it had evolved. Perhaps it was now something worse. She excused herself from him at the next natural pause and moved along the wall toward the refreshment table, which required her to pass within 6 feet of the woman Crispin had spoken to, close enough to see the expression that settled over the woman's face when she identified Georgiana, which was a combination of curiosity and pity that was the season's most particular cruelty, the look that said, "We know something about you that you would not want known." She kept her face entirely smooth and her pace entirely even, and reached the refreshment table, where she stood for a moment with a glass of lemonade she did not want, and breathed. "Whatever he said," said the Earl at her left shoulder, "it will not hold." She turned. He had come up beside her with the quiet efficiency of a tall man who had learned to move without announcement. He was close enough that she could see the grain of his cravat, a fine white silk tied with precise care, and was aware of the warmth of him against the cooler air from the window. "How can you know that?" she said. "Because he has said things about you for 2 years in a city that now knows you are present, in silk, at every occasion that matters, managing yourself with perfect competence and declining to be either destroyed or pitied." He looked out at the room. The market for his version of events has thinned considerably. She wanted very much to believe this. She was not quite certain she did. "He told that woman something," she said. She looked at me. "Lady Pemberton's cousin," he said. "I know her slightly. She will go home tonight and discover that half the women she respects have already recalibrated in your direction, and she will recalibrate too." He paused. "The season follows the strongest current. You are the current now. He is behind you." She looked at him. The candlelight was warm and close, and found the angle of his jaw, the steadiness behind his eyes. "You are very certain," she said. "I have been watching the room for 2 hours," he said. "I have a reliable sample." She laughed, which surprised her. It was a real laugh, brief and quiet, the kind she had not produced in public in a long time. His expression did something that was still not quite a smile, but was the thing the smile was pointing toward. "There is something," she said carefully, "that I have been meaning to ask you." "Ask it." "You said, in the park, that you remember everything you have occasion to observe carefully. I am wondering what, precisely, you observed at Ravesworth in 1818, beyond the drainage." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the music had begun again, a soft piece for pianoforte, and the room had rearranged itself to attend to it. "You arbitrated a dispute between 2 tenants," he said, "involving a shared wall and a question of grazing rights. You heard both men out, at length, in the kitchen passage, which was the only neutral space available, and you rendered a judgment that required both men to concede something, and gave both men something in return. And you did it without consulting your husband's steward, who was standing in the doorway, and who I saw look at your husband afterward with an expression that said he had just understood something about why the Duke had married you." He paused. "I thought about that for some time after I returned to Blackmore, about what it meant to witness someone in the full exercise of their actual capacities." She was aware of her heart in a way that was not comfortable and not unpleasant. "That was a small matter," she said, with considerable effort toward evenness. "Yes," he said. "Which is why it told me more than a large one would have." She did not answer immediately. She stood in the warm light of the Harcastle Music Hall, with the pianoforte playing behind her, and the man beside her steady and close and waiting, not impatiently, in the way of a man who has learned to wait. "I am not," she said eventually, "ready to make any decisions." "I know," he said. "I have been home for 3 weeks." "I know. And my situation is still being actively contested by a man who has a financial motive and a temperamental talent for the specific cruelty of suggestion." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you for a decision." She looked at him. "What are you asking for?" He was quiet for a moment. "Permission," he said, "to be visible about where I stand, so that the room has accurate information." Something in her chest did something that was not a medical event, but felt like adjacent to one. "That is," she said, "the most practical declaration I have ever received." "I am," he said with complete seriousness, "a practical man." She looked at the room. She looked at the candles, each in their holders. She looked at Crispin across the length of the musicale, who was watching them both now with the expression of a man revising a calculation. "You have my permission," she said. He did not make a scene of it. He moved only slightly, so that the distance between them diminished by perhaps 8 inches, and his right arm was close enough to her left that the wool of his sleeve just touched the silk of her gown. It was the smallest possible action, and in the grammar of this room, at this musicale, in this year of her return, it was enormous. She heard Mrs. Holt's fan close with a sharp snap somewhere to her right. Crispin, across the room, turned away. What followed was not sudden. It was accumulative, which is the only honest way for these things to be. Over the following 6 weeks, he attended the occasions she attended. He spoke with the people she needed to speak with, and spoke well of her when the subject arose. And when the subject arose because Crispin had arranged it, he spoke with the particular precision of a man who has his facts straight and his source certain, which was its own silencing. He called at the townhouse twice weekly. She called at Blackmore House once, which was a statement she made deliberately and which the season discussed for 3 days, before concluding that it was in fact evidence of her social confidence rather than evidence of anything else. He walked beside her in the park. He sat to her left at dinner when the opportunity presented. He read the same journals and had opinions about drainage and land tenure and the current disposition of the corn laws that were substantive and that he had clearly formed through actual engagement with the subject matter, which was not a universal quality of men in this city. She showed him the Ravesworth account books on a Tuesday afternoon because they required a pair of eyes she trusted, and because the steward had flagged an anomaly in the northern lease she could not fully account for. He bent over the ledger with the focused attention of a man who genuinely wanted to understand the numbers and identified the source of the anomaly, which was a transcription error dating to the previous year, within 20 minutes. He looked up and found her watching him. "Well," she said. "It's a clerical error," he said. "Nothing worse. The actual receipts are here." He pointed. "I know," she said. "I thought it might be. I wanted to be certain." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said quietly, "Georgiana." It was the first time. She had known it would be a marked event. She had not anticipated the specific quality of the marking, which was that her entire name felt like a different thing in his mouth than it had ever felt when anyone else said it, as though he had been considering it carefully and was now ready to release it. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything, but was the only available word. He closed the ledger carefully. He was standing very close to her over the desk, and did not move back when she did not move back. "I have been trying," he said, "to be patient." "You have been patient," she said. "I have been patient because you needed me to be, and I understood that." He paused. "I am still patient. What I want is not for the season to have accurate information, though I also want that. What I want is you. Specifically. This is not a strategic position." She looked at him. Her hands wanted to do something, and she was very carefully not permitting them. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time." "And?" She reached out and placed her hand over his, which was resting on the closed ledger. His hand turned under hers and held it, and the warmth of that was something she had not anticipated in its specific weight. The feeling of her hand correctly located. The feeling of the room settling into the right shape around them. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am not choosing you because you are useful, or because the season's calculations make it sensible, or because you were patient." "I know," he said. "I am choosing you because you sat across from me in my own sitting room and told me something true that cost you something to say, and because you remember a tenant dispute from 8 years ago, and because you find specific cruelties offensive, And because when you say my name, it sounds like you have been keeping it somewhere." She paused. "And because you were right about the drainage." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was not triumph or relief exactly, but the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not entirely certain he would arrive. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. Simply, without qualification. His hand tightened around hers. She would think later that she had never been asked a question whose answer she knew so completely. 2 years of northern solitude and managed accounts and cedar boxes full of Marjorie's letters had produced in her a clarity about what she wanted that the season, for all its understanding of other women's hearts, had not been able to calculate. She had wanted to be the right size for the room she was in. She had wanted the work taken seriously. She had wanted, when her name was said, to feel like the person who owned it. He gave her all of these things simultaneously, which was an economy she appreciated. The announcement appeared in the Gazette 3 weeks later. It was read aloud at 2 breakfast tables and 4 morning calls, and was discussed at length in the drawing rooms of the sort of women who discuss such things with energy and specificity. Marjorie read it over her coffee at 10 in the morning and set it down with an expression of such perfect satisfaction that her housekeeper asked if she were well. "I am exceedingly well," Marjorie said. "Some things take longer than they should, and arrive at exactly the right moment. This is one of them." Crispin read it at his club. He set the paper down, ordered a brandy, and spent the remainder of the afternoon in a thoughtful silence that his companions found uncharacteristic and somewhat unnerving. He did not contest the announcement. He had run out of instruments. The season processed the information with its usual thorough attention, and arrived, over the course of a fortnight, at a conclusion it packaged as inevitable in retrospect. Of course, a woman like that, managing her own estate, holding her title through 2 years of legal dispute and social difficulty without fracturing, conducting herself at every occasion with that particular quality of competence and composure. Of course, the word grasping did not appear in these conversations. They married in October, in a small church in Northumberland, near Ravensworth Hall, on a morning when the trees had gone to amber and the stone walls held the cold in the particular way of northern places. There were 16 people present, which was exactly right. Marjorie sat in the second row with her face entirely composed and her eyes entirely bright. He put the ring on her hand with the careful attention he put on everything, as though it were a fact he was recording accurately. She said the words that were required and meant every syllable. If there was a lesson here, she thought it was not the one the season would report. The season would say she had been vindicated, which was true, and that she had found a great match, which was also true, and that the 2 years in the North had turned out to be a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent diminishment. The season was correct, but it was looking at the surface of the thing. The thing itself was this. She had gone north with nothing but the estate and her own capacities, and had discovered that the estate and her own capacities were more than enough. She had come back not because she needed the season's verdict reversed, but because she knew the verdict had been wrong, and she had learned, in 2 years of early mornings and difficult accounts and letters sent and received, that she was not required to live inside anyone else's wrong assessment of her. The rumor had buried her, as it supposed. She had found the rumor a very poor grave. That evening, at Ravensworth Hall, the fire was lit in the long sitting room that looked out over the north field. There was no snowfall, but the air carried the promise of it, the specific cold and quiet of northern England in October. He sat in the chair beside the fire with a glass of port and the Ravensworth estate accounts, which he had asked to review because he was genuinely interested in the anomaly question, and she sat at the writing desk with a letter to Marjorie that she would finish tomorrow. She looked at him in the firelight. He was reading with the focused attention she had come to know as his particular rhythm, and he was entirely at home in her house, which was her house and would be their house. And the fire made his face amber and warm, and she was aware in the quiet room with the cold outside and the warmth between them that she was the right size for every room she was in. She turned back to her letter. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, very quietly, on the north field. Thank you for staying until the end. If Georgiana's story found its way into you somewhere, leave a thought in the comments below.